Classroom anarchy at an all-time high. It's like Animal House in second grade. California is now poised to ban public and charter schools from expelling any students who happen to be disruptive. Apparently, the only thing that will get you expelled in California is failing to use someone's preferred pronoun. I'm Dr. Duke, she's Katie, and this is the Dr. Duke Show. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Back to School Week here on the Dr. Duke Show, the only show that keeps you educated on the craziness impacting K-12 classrooms and college campuses around the world. Today, we're taking a look at the New York Times new 1619 project, which includes new curriculum challenging teachers to reframe U.S. history in the classroom to push fake facts, fake quotes, and no evidence. But we start in the land of fruits and nuts, where the state of California is preparing to pass legislation that would ban the expulsion of any K through 8 student who actually is disruptive in school. Yeah, this is serious now. So you've got literally anarchy in California schools, American schools, the idea that you're not allowed to discipline kids, that their feelings are going to get hurt. And if you discipline kids, that means inevitably minority students are going to get disciplined worse.
Well, now, if I decide to punch you in the face or kick my other fellow classmates, I'm not going to be punished at all, because in California, they've figured it out that if you can just yell at California lawmakers, they'll bow to the whims. And that's what the Assembly did when they voted 58-17 for Senate Bill 419, and it now has to go back to the Senate for some amendments, and obviously it's going to go on to Governor Gavin Newsom. Ugh. If we can call him a governor, and he'll sign it and be like, oh, bow to the whims of the children.
Justin Trudeau without the flashy wardrobe is what Gavin Newsom is.
He is.
And the problem with this is manifest. In fact, in many ways, what's happening here in California public schools is a microcosm of how liberals work. You identify the power dynamic, and in this case, it's in the classroom. These evil teachers with all the disciplinary power, and these poor picked-on children who just don't get to express themselves. And you identify the power, and then what you immediately have to do is you rally the minority group, the kids, to shout down any idea of discipline in the classroom whatsoever. This is exactly how the Democrat progressives operate, isn't it? The outrage mob, the perpetrators, the ones who are disrupting, the ones who are causing the trouble. Well, look at the way they treat Antifa, right? Antifa's the one throwing the rocks. Antifa is the one beating on buses with hammers. But it's the Proud Boys who are the problem.
No, it says it's
They're anti-fascist.
Just right there in their name.
Just because we're believing like fascists doesn't mean we're fighting fascists.
That's what we're doing.
Sometimes you got a Nazi to fight a Nazi. Sometimes you got to put on the uniform and Nazi if you're a progressive, fighting Nazis. Sometimes all they're missing is the goose step.
Yeah. Well, and now in California, they're going to not see, as in blind, they're going to not see any of the disruption going on in these schools. So SB 419, I want to give some of the language here. It's going to prohibit, and I'm going to say will prohibit because he's going to sign this. It will become law in California, in your not too distant future. It's going to prohibit you from suspending any student from kindergarten to 8th grade if they, quote, disrupt school activities or otherwise willfully defy the valid authority of supervisors, teachers, administrators, or school officials. And this would begin next school year in 2020.
And it's not just teachers, it's supervisors, it's administrators. So if these kids interrupt a superintendent's speech on campus, right, and start throwing things, you cannot suspend these kids. You can't do it.
Kindergarten through 8th grade. Here's my question, because wouldn't the police liaison officer be a school official at that time?
Well, an authority.
An authority.
The word was an authority.
Supervisor, teacher.
That includes cops. Yep. Includes campus cops in California who already don't have guns.
So,
right?
Yep, and so they can't get kicked out of any of that stuff. They can't be expelled from school for the same reason. They can't. What can you do then, teachers? Or anyone, any adult, basically any adult, what can you do?
Well, this raises the question. We've seen over the years, and on this show, we've 3 or 4 times documented situations where kids have lost it and started punching teachers or wrestling with teachers.
In Baltimore,
or fighting with other students, right, in the middle of class. Under this law now, if I get angry as an 8-year-old and beat the crap out of the 8-year-old sitting next to me in the middle of a math test, I mean, technically, you have no authority to get rid of me, do you?
No, not in the least.
I mean, you could say, well, that doesn't include violence, but why not?
Yeah, well, and here's the thing. You may argue, okay, well, that's public schools. What about the charter schools? Tell me about what's happening in the charter schools. Are they exempt from this?
No, and this shows you how bad it's gotten. California has ordered charter schools, all charter schools, if this law passes, they'll have to do it too. And that's the reminder, maybe that's the good place to end this segment. You who think school choice, and this is the only answer to the Republicans have one bullet in their gun, and it's school choice.
Yeah.
And this is the problem with that bullet, Republicans, because if the state's paying for it, you're going to have to conform to it.
Yep. And just so clarification on the charter schools, it affects the 6th, 7th, and 8th graders, and there's supposed to be a sunset clause in 2025, unless it's extended, which it would be extended.
California.
It's California.
The sun is always rising, not setting, when it comes to progressive
initiatives.
initiatives.
And it never rains in southern.
Don't make me.
You're going to sing it again?
I'm out of work. I'm out of my head. I'm out of self-respect. I'm out of bread. I'm underloved, I'm underfed. Well, no, kind of, not really.
No, yeah.
I want to go home.
Okay.
Next story.
Moving on. Let's go across the whole nation, all the way to New York, where the New York Times, once a newspaper, decided that they're going to have a brand new project and educate all of America, because they're history teachers now. So they unveiled something called the 1619 Project. 1619 represents the year 1619. And they did this in mid-August, and they claim that since January, at the New York Times Magazine, they've been working on an issue to mark the 400th anniversary of the first enslaved people arriving in America. And it's going to include a special section, there's a multi-part audio series, and more. And this whole project that is comprised of all these different articles and, audio series and all that, was devised actually just in a staff meeting. They're like, we need to, you give pitches for ideas. And one staff writer, her name is Nicole Hannah-Jones, gave the pitch at the staff meeting saying that we need to do a whole issue on slavery and we need to educate Americans.
What's really amazing to me about this is that the New York Times is an educational body. And the New York Times, we know from watching them, is fake news. They've lost the first lesson of education. Tell the truth, right? These non-educators now have created the 1619 Project, and you didn't mention it. Should be obvious, but if we've got some public school kids listening, it wouldn't be. 1619 is the year before 1620, Mayflower, Pilgrims, and all of that. And so what we're going to do, this entire program is basically the Howard Zinnification of America on steroids. Howard Zinn gave us the so-called People's History of America in the 70s and 80s, which was a complete and utter socialist rewriting of American history from the founding through today. It was taking American history and eradicating and removing anything that was not part of the socialist narrative. This is the same thing here. Oh, and by the way, I'm willing to bet you that 1619, there was no United States of America. 1619, there was no colonial revolution. 1619, there was no Constitution. 1619, there was no Bill of Rights or Declaration of Independence. 1619, it's the British's problem. Why don't you start talking about the British then and leave the Americans alone?
Of course, but here's how they did it instead. So what happened in that sales pitch meeting? Everyone is immediately on board. So they're like, we're going to do this. So the editor, Jake Silverstein, says that this issue is an opportunity for us to do something that was necessary. Those involved knew it was a big task, they said. It was a big task, and one that would require the expertise of those who have dedicated their entire lives and careers to studying the nuances of what it means to be a black person in America. And so, with that, you know that they were putting all their focus on seeing America through that little lens they call racism.
Who in that room was actually black? Silverstein is not one of them.
Nicole Hannah-Jones, the one who sales pitched it.
That's right, the sales pitched it. And Silverstein and the rest of the New York Times editorial board, what do they know about spending their whole life studying this? And the other thing I would say to you is this is utterly unnecessary. For the last 30 years, our kids have been getting only the slave narrative version of American history. Our kids aren't learning anything but slavery in the schools. As I have documented in my own classrooms, over and over again, my college kids are convinced that slavery is an American problem. No one else did it. No one else had it. We're alone guilty of it. The narrative of history for 20 years that my kids have had has always revolved around slavery and tyranny. In this year, Americans did these bad things. This war was all about this racism. This is how women were mistreated in these periods. They don't know anything else. So you're going to go back now and you're going to frame this again from 1619 forward the way you've already framed it, just more of it.
Yeah, but even Okay, and exactly. The issue, as someone who actually enjoys history and studying and getting, truth in reporting, 1619 may have been that year, but what happened in 1607? We had Jamestown. If we're going to say that America started in 1619, you have to go back to 1607 then and say Jamestown when people first arrived. You can't just pinpoint there because there's still no America. And we see from Hannah Jones, the one who spearheaded this thing, her keynote essay, because they did numerous different articles by different scholars. They did consult some historians, but only the liberal-minded ones. They cherry-picked which, obviously, authors they wanted. But in her essay called The Idea of America, she says, the prevailing narrative taught in schools is that Black Americans' history begins with enslavement, and they had contributed little to the founding of this nation. Instead, she writes that it is we, because she's African American, who have been the perfecters of this democracy.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you were both, this is the typical leftist narrative. We were both utterly disempowered. We were utterly crushed of our ability. We were so hideously enslaved that we had no agency, and when we're racist, it doesn't count. On the other hand, we're responsible for all that's good in this country.
Perfecters.
That's the narrative. And I'll go one step further. You keep telling us, progressive lefty lunatics, that America was America before Americans got here because the Native Americans were the first Americans. They were the first possessors of the land. How about this? Since that's the narrative, right? Sure. That Native America began with the Native Americans. Okay. That we should spend a lot more time studying Americans. How about the 1519 Project, which goes and looks at how Native American tribes waged war on other Native American tribes and enslaved other citizens of other tribes? How about that? How about we go back to Europe and America? We were told just last week, right? America is a term we've got to stop using because you got Canada and you've got South America. We're all Americans. Let's go back to the 14th century. How about 1319? How about 819? And do the Inca, Aztec, and Maya beginning of the country.
Favorites.
And let's talk about building pyramids on the blood of human sacrifices. You keep telling us that America belongs to everybody but Americans. It was the Native Americans, then it's the blacks who perfected America, right? You keep telling us that, but the only one you want to hold accountable for the misery of America is the people who you say it doesn't belong to.
Okay. Need a minute?
I think I had a aneurysm.
Did you? Well, you're still kicking, so good. All right, so the reason this is even more important here in our back to school week is that our students are going back to school and sitting in the classroom where they're supposed to be learning history, and our teachers are being told by the New York Times that, hey, you better teach a 1619 project. And the teachers are responding with, Yahoo!
Yes, sir. Why is it? We asked this on yesterday's show. I'm going to ask it again. What qualifications does the New York Times have? Why are teachers and teachers unions and superintendents and principals glomming onto this? If you and I, Katie, did the 1519 program, and we went to the schools, they'd laugh at our faces and call us anti-Native American. But because the New York Times or Planned Parenthood or the LGBTQ activists or drag queen activists are doing this stuff. So in other words, the public schools belong to everybody who happens to be progressive. No idea is too stupid and too progressive, too historically inaccurate from a leftist perspective to immediately incorporate into our schools. We don't vote on it. We don't consult the parents. We don't even need textbooks. You bring us a dumb idea like this, we'll start teaching it because you're liberals. But that does not cut the other way.
Of course not. Well, Education Week, as soon as this came out, basically touted this project as an opportunity to reframe U.S. history. And in the lead of their article, they said, most school children can recite, okay, this is funny. Most school children can recite the founding date of the United States of America, July 4, 1776. No, false.
No, they can't.
They cannot do that. College kids cannot do it. Adults cannot do it. I test them. They cannot. Continuing.
Most kids understand that we're a republic, not a democracy.
What? A what?
No, they don't. And this is my big pet peeve. As a 25-year educator, we keep hearing about how these kids come to class so steeped in American mythology, so blindly racistly patriotic. It's not true.
It's not. They continue, but a searing project, they say, from the New York Times Magazine changes that date to August 20th, 1619. The day 20 enslaved Africans first arrived on Virginia soil. Want to teach 1619 as a true founding.
Hey, what about those slaves in 1618? They were still slaves. And what about the history of African slaves that goes back 200, 300, 400 years ago? How about this? How about tracing those slaves Back to the Islamic slave trade of the Middle Ages. How about that?
No, that's too
You
much
think?
work. Too much work.
Oh,
We're
well,
going to
why
just go
not?
16-9.
You don't want them to know that earlier history. You don't want them to know that there was any slavery but American slavery, even though technically it's still Britain.
And here's what they're doing now in our kids' classroom. The Pulitzer Center created the curriculum for teachers of all grade levels based on this groundbreaking project. So, day one of class, after your kid comes home, you ask them in history class, did you hear of something called the 1619 Project? Because those kids are going to get,
Hammered.
the teachers, they're going to get hammered with it. The teachers have the curriculum. And of course, the Pulitzer Center curriculum offers discussion questions and guided reading.
Isn't it amazing that for the last 30, 40 years, the teaching of history has been an afterthought in American schools? That our kids are less historically, you can't dispute this, liberals. Our kids are historically ignorant. You go to your favorite universities, Harvard and Yale, and Jimmy Kimmel or one of these guys jams a microphone under one of these Ivy League kids who's paying $80,000 a year for his education, and they can't tell you anything about civics, can't tell you anything about American history. Isn't it interesting that the New York Times now is excited about history again when you can basically lie about it?
The issue that we're having now is we're finding very easily, without even having to do hardly any research, that the people who are writing these articles that our students are supposed to be learning from are fabricating
They're
things.
making stuff up.
They are lying to you. So Cornell University scholar Edward Baptist is cited in one of these 1619 articles, and he makes this tie from slavery to capitalism. Course. But his credibility has been called into question over the years, starting with his 2014 book called The Half Has Never Been Told. The half has never been told. Ooh, provocative. In his book, Baptist argues that modern capitalism still contains many of the remnants of slavery and that America's current economy is still influenced by the exploitation of slaves.
That's why multi-million dollar athletes like LeBron James can call themselves slaves.
Colin Kaepernick.
Colin Kaepernick with his $40 million contract is a slave.
Exactly.
I got it now. I see. That's where that came from.
So the 1619 article, again, 1619 articles are being in our classrooms now, was written by a man named Matthew Desmond. He's a Princeton professor. And in his article, he cites Baptist. And he said that in order to understand the brutality of American capitalism, you have to start on the plantation. And then this is where he quotes Baptist, saying that before the Civil War, Americans lived in an economy whose bottom gear was torture.
Wait, and you understand this? In order to understand the violence of capitalism.
Yes.
So what's the real message here? Is the real message slavery for slavery's sake because we feel bad for what people suffered 200 years ago? Or is it to take down the patriarchy, take down free markets? Mm-hmm. I mean, they tip their hand everywhere, and you can go through and read some of these articles. Again, these people have no qualifications. None of this stuff has been vetted by educators. They have in no way, shape, or form run this past school boards, but it's in schools now because they're progressives at the New York Times.
And that's going to wrap it up for today. As always, please share this episode and subscribe to the free audio podcast on iTunes, SoundCloud, and everywhere else. Visit drdukeshow.com, click on any of the platforms that you see at the top, and remember, subscribe. It's free.
And that does it for us today. We will be back tomorrow at 6 p.m. Central Standard Time for another episode of the Dr. Duke Show. For Freedom Project, I'm Dr. Duke, she's Katie, and until next time, stay educated, my friends.